Hello, I'm Karina Moxon, Editor-in-Chief of the LSE Undergraduate Political Review and third-year Government and History student here at the LSE. The Government Department's been screening Peterloo this evening, and we've had a Q&A from director Mike Leigh and historian Jacqueline Riding, and I caught up with them to get some insight into the film. When I spoke to Mike Leigh, I wanted to find out what motivated him to tell the story of the Peterloo Massacre and the relevance it has to the modern day. Hi Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's nice to be here.
So what I wanted to know at first was, what drew you to Peterloo? Why did you want to focus on that for your film?
Well, it's an important subject. Apart from anything else, it is of interest that it happened almost exactly 200 years ago, August 1819. And it seemed a good idea to make a film that would be ready for that bicentenary. But more important than that is it is an important event historically. It was a major, catastrophic and important landmark in the history of democracy in this country and probably universally. And it's a story that hasn't been told. It's been told in various ways, but there's never been a movie about it. And that alone is as a good arena as any to make one.
Do you think there's a merit in historical films in terms of educating the public?
There is a merit in anything that makes us, think and feel and care about the way we live. Yeah. I mean, a film that is an historical film has no meaning unless the audience is going to interpret it, process it in such a way as to worry and care about the world that we live in, the contemporary world. There's no point, in my view, of a historical film that is so remote and leaves you so unconnected with whatever's going on that it's simply merely a chocolate box and it doesn't have any meaning in terms of the... And I don't really think audiences can process anything other than in terms of how each individual sees and experiences the world, emotionally and in every other way. So in that sense, of course, it's very valid to make films of an historical nature. Now, I mean, what one has to be clear about when it comes to talking about Peterloo is that it is a film where we've taken very seriously the job of telling the story of what happened in 1819. But it's not a documentary. It is a dramatisation. It is a distillation of what happened. It isn't, I mean, there are all kinds of things in the film which are, by definition, invented, because, you can read all the books in the world about anything historical, but you can't, that doesn't make it happen in front of the camera. Yeah. You've got to breathe into these characters in a detailed way so that they exist in a very three-dimensional manner, so that you can bring it to life and make it tick, and and so it very much is a dramatisation, but at the same time we've been very, very serious about getting to the essence of what really happened and what it means and what it meant. The other thing about the film, which I think is worth saying, is that the event, the thing that is called the Peterloo Massacre that happened in St. Peter's Field in Manchester on August the 16th, 1819, does finally occupy a serious chunk of the film, because that's what it's about. You could, hypothetically, make a film that just showed that, but it would be meaningless. Yeah. Because, I mean, as you've seen, by the time we get to that in the film, you've really seen all sorts of factions on all sides of the argument and understood who they are and what they're about, basically. So that you've therefore, you, the audience, have in some way invested in the capacity to understand and care about what's going on.
Yeah, that I was going to ask that. Yeah, because obviously quite a lot of the film is really building up a sense of the characters, you know, what's going on.
And the ideas and the issues involved.
Yeah, and even what I found was interesting was how it kind of showed that not everyone was completely ready to protest, you know, when they went to the rallies and then the men came home to the wives and they were like, well, you're not going to be able to achieve anything. I thought that was quite a really important...
It is, and it was a big leap for people, you know. And also there had been other protests that had been dealt with in a draconian way, but none so draconian as this when it came to it.
In terms of bringing Henry Hampton into Manchester, and you know, so obviously he did go there in real life. But what do you think, like the symbolism of Henry Hampton is? Was he like a figurehead for the whole? Well,
he was, from what we understand, and this we've obviously dramatised. He was a charismatic character. He was a great orator. He was obviously a massive egocentric and self-advertiser. Well, we've got that. I mean, Rory Kinnear gets that. And that all comes out of the research, you know. It would seem that he had a very, very powerful voice, though, of course, one of the things that it's very easy to forget about all public meetings down to the 20th century is that nobody could hear anything. I mean, people talk about, you know, Lincoln at Gettysburg, the famous Gettysburg speech. Well, probably no more than 100 or so people actually heard what he was saying because there was no public address system. And we've actually put that into the film at one point. But he did apparently have a very great voice, but also he was a very articulate orator and fighter for the cause.
In terms of having to choose to leave out certain characters, what was your thinking behind that? How did you approach that?
First of all, if we're honest, the film perpetrates one great massive cheat, which is to say it starts with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and it ends with the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. Now on paper that means 4 years have gone past, and there's no way when you're watching the film you think 4 years have gone past. You don't, but hopefully you don't think about it one way or the other. That's the trick, because actually all the events that happened within those 4 years were many and various, all relevant to the actual story historically, but there's no way you could include all that in a 2.5-hour film. It would be a 2.5-year film. I mean, and everyone would get particularly pissed off with it, really. So, you know, it is about distilling the essence of things so that what is there really resonates and makes you understand and care about what did actually happen. Yeah. So in other words, we evoke the thing rather than simply in an academic way record it or report it.
Yeah. So something that stood out to me was the inclusion of the women's movement. You know, obviously there's the focus in the meeting, and even at the, I guess when they're starting to protest or, you know, at the rally, there's, you know, the camera does focus on them quite a bit.
Well, I mean, that's simply, again, that's a fact of what happened. I mean, the female reform movement was active. I mean, what is interesting to us is, of course, that they embraced at that stage. They embraced the vast majority of the politicised women, embraced the notion of one man, one vote, and they saw it as one vote per family. There was a tiny minority of women who were actually onto female suffrage, but in fact, we thought that was so minor historically that it would be a kind of detailed red herring to incorporate it. Of course, as the 19th century progressed, the proper notion of universal suffrage took off, of course. But no, we've again gone back to these women who actually existed and actually, you know, were there and were articulate.
Do you think there are parallels between Peterloo and modern day politics?
Do you think there are parallels between Peterloo and modern day politics? I mean, here's the thing, you know, of course I do, and it goes without saying. And what is interesting is that we decided to make this film and started working on it in 2014. And gradually, well, actually, almost on a daily basis, once we got going with the research and the preparation, we found ourselves saying, this is becoming increasingly relevant. Because what we didn't know is that there was this event just around the corner called Brexit, which raises all kinds of questions about democracy and people expressing themselves and all the rest of it. So, you know, it's not for me to make the film and then explain in detail why it's relevant, because it just is, and anybody that's on the case will spot it.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
When I spoke to Jacqueline Riding, the historian behind Peterloo, it gave a different perspective on the events and how they were translated into film. Hi Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us after the screening of Peterloo. Obviously it's such a historical film, and based on your recent book about Peterloo, I was wondering what actually drew you to that event?
Well, the book is actually based on the film rather than the other way around. So I worked with Mike on Mr. Turner. That was my first film with him, and then he obviously had such a great time working with me on that when I suggested that I work on Peterloo, because that was his next film, he invited me to join him. So it was very much led by Mike and his fascination and interest in the story of Peterloo. Having worked on the film for over 2 years, because it's a very intense experience as a historian, you're there from the get-go, you're working right the way through from initial readings, broad narrative histories of Peterloo, right the way through to being on set for 4 months, the whole time for 4 months during rehearsals and shoots and so on. It's a very intense experience for a historian. Then when we finished filming in September 2017, I did an exhibition at the Foundling Museum not far from here, and then straight after that I started re-researching, going back to the National Archives, in order to write a book, in order to accompany the film. So the film is an artwork, obviously, on its own and can be seen on its own, but the book was produced in many ways to act as a historical support to the amount of research and work that we'd done on the film. But if anyone watched the film and thought, I wonder what happens to John Bagley or Sam Bamford or Henry Hunt, what happens to them, what happened to the movement, the reform movement, after the film finishes, obviously the go-to book would be the one I've produced to accompany it.
So were there any challenges in particular that, in terms of like translating the history into the film, you know, like at which point did you start narrowing things down, and like in terms of actually conveying it on the screen?
That's very much led by Mike. Yeah. So I'm his extra brain, and that's all you need to know about me. So if Mike decides, you know, obviously we started looking at the broad brushstrokes, the broader histories, to read in general the Peterloo story, as it were. And then once Mike starts to pick up particular aspects that interest him, particular characters and so on, he will signal to me that that's what he's interested in, and I'll start to burrow in. Yeah. Then when he starts to form groups, because it's fairly obvious if you've seen the film, there are groups of people that kind of can be brought together to work together as actors when you've cast. The magistrates, the hussars, the female reformers, the male reformers, royalty, members of parliament, government, and so on. So they act in little groups. So once we've sort of cast and set up those groups and individuals, then I'm working on with them as actors to establish their characters, to feed them information, to help them as they're doing research, but also to arrange group visits to relevant places like, let's say, the Palace of Westminster, where I used to work for 6 years as assistant curator, or the Royal, the Horse Guards Museum, to meet an actual, officer from the Horse Guards, so he can tell you what it's like being in a mounted regiment, and that's obviously really important and vital for somebody who's playing a hussar. We also visited the police. The main police stables in Whitehall, in order to talk to an officer of the mounted division of the police, to talk about how you deal with crowd control on horseback. Okay. So if you've seen the film again, you'll see that during the massacre itself, obviously the various mounted divisions, whether amateur or professional, turn up to, in some way, to control the crowd. And some of the techniques that they use are not dissimilar to the techniques that you use now. So a little bit is kind of hands-on, practical, living history, if you like. Yeah. And then a lot of it is visiting archives, like the National Archive that we were talking about just now, looking at the extensive archive material for the Home Office, which is where all the papers are, both for the letters going out from the Home Office to the Manchester magistrates, and then all the letters coming back again. There are copies of all of them. So you can follow the thread of the history of how we got to St. Peter's Field itself through, archive material like that.
Yeah. In terms of the kind of like transcript of the film, were there any points where you actually translated things you'd read in the archives to the script? Was that?
Absolutely, yes. So, for example, the scenes, the most obvious ones are the scenes in Parliament. For example, when Lord Liverpool congratulates Wellington on the victory at Waterloo, and then that speech that he gives, offering X amount of money to him as a reward from a grateful nation, that was derived from a speech that Liverpool made on exactly that occasion. So that was modified and adapted, and then becomes the speech so that's Hansard. Yeah. Ditto the speech and some of the commentary that Lord Sidmouth makes when he's in the chamber, and indeed the speech that the Prince Regent makes at the state opening of Parliament. And then when the actors went off to do their research, we went with them to the archive as group sessions, magistrates or Home Office clerks and so on. We took them to the Home Office papers at the archive. They could actually read their own characters, like Henry Hobhouse, their own characters' actual letters and the way they phrase things. Yeah. And so some of that they picked up and then could sort of fold into the dialogues when we started improvising and rehearsing.
In terms of the actual, say, the groupings, we were just talking about the women's movement and stuff, was that harder to necessarily find maybe direct translations off to put into the speech just because of lack of materials?
Good point. I mean, it's women's history full stop has only really gained ground over the last 20 or so years. You could read general histories on Peterloo and barely have the women mentioned at all, other than Mary Fildes, who she was on the hustings, so she's the most famous woman in the context of the event itself. But over the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of work done on women's involvement in politics and public involvement in politics as well. And so there was a lot less information on them and the Female Manchester Reform Society and so on, and even very little information when we were doing the film. I think there's more now because there's a lot more being published, but very little on Mary Fildes, Susanna Saxton. So we knew who they were, we knew what they were, and really it was great for the actors who play Mary Fildes and Susanna, for example, or any of the female reformers. They had good, solid, scholarship that had occurred over the last 10, 15 years or so to read, generally speaking, about women's involvement in the reform movement. But then they could go off and do their own research to try and sort of burrow in and try and find Susanna Saxton and find Mary Fildes and find out information about them. So by the time they've sort of finished filming, in many ways, they become the world experts on that character. Now, we know a lot more about Henry Hunt, we know a lot more about Sam Bamford, but we know relatively little about Mary and Susanna. So that was one, I think they really enjoyed working and doing the research, because Mike chooses actors who will immerse themselves fully in the whole process, not just the acting, but also they have some joy in the actual researching itself, and love archives, love burrowing, doing all the stuff that we as historians love to do. They are people who love to do that as well, and to build up the character in relationship with Mike, in order to, by the time you get to the set, you've got this fully fleshed out individual who's the character you're playing.
In terms of when you began writing your book after the film, was there anything from the whole film process that you thought, I want to develop more?
Sort of across the piece, really, because the film, even if you've got a whole scene showing the Female Reform Society, to an extent, it gives you a snapshot. It's a kind of a sort of a simmering down of the material. And it gives you a really great impression of what it must have been like to be a woman in 1819, sort of rallying behind the men to get the vote and so on. But there was a lot more that could be, that we used in order to create that scene, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knew how much work we'd done on it. So I had an entire chapter on the female reform, the whole history of it, and that the fact it was a very recent phenomenon and very much, to an extent in this period, a northwest phenomenon, northwest of England. Yeah. So I just wanted to show the kind of the distillation that had occurred from the massive reading that all of us had done. Yeah. That had this distillation that you see in the film. I then sort of added a bit of water and expanded it back out again for the book.
Do you think there's a role that historians can play linking to film? Do you think it's quite important to kind of portray historical events through film, whether it's to educate the public or anything like that?
I think Well, if you work with Mike, then if he's doing a historical film, he'll want a historian on board because, as I say, he wants to know what is known about it, what the facts are, what the information is about it, so he can decide to follow or not that. Everything's done in an informed way. The movie is a movie, not a documentary, so it's based on history, but it's very much an artwork in its own right, a freestanding artwork, and it's very much Mike's movie. And as I say, I'm there to be the extra brain, to feed him the information for him to then create, along with everybody else, you know, the designers for the production and costume and makeup and so on. As the historian on the production, with a Mike production, you're there for 2 years and you're working with all those departments as well as with Mike and with the actors and so on. So it is a very immersive, very sort of intense 2 years. As a historian, I learned a hell of a lot working with Mike. You're very conscious working on film, and particularly working on one of Mike's films. You're very conscious of character, dialogue, scene setting, you know, because as the historian, you have to help with the construction of the scene itself. So if you wrote something that said Henry Hunt walked into a room, you could do that in a history. And delivered his speech and then walked out again. But in a film, you have to animate it. You also have to recreate it. And it could be on the screen for a split second, but a lot of time and effort has gone into recreating that room he walked into. The glass he picked up, what was in it, what did the glass look like, what was he wearing, how did he speak? All those things have to be dealt with. And then sort of, hopefully, the research is worn lightly. But the research is all there, and it's the foundation of what you see. So I think the other thing is that it's a bit of a, so I think Hilary Mantel talks about this idea that these characters don't know they're in a history movie. The characters think they're in the contemporary world where they're fighting for the vote and so on. So that's what I mean by wearing the research lightly, is that hopefully what the audience will get is they'll feel that they're seeing living, breathing people who you could almost imagine were sitting next to you in the chair, that it's worn that lightly, that it feels very contemporary. Because they themselves would never have thought of themselves as being 200 years old. They're actually living in the moment, in the contemporary moment. And this is all live, and it's not history, it's current.
I think it was portrayed really well. We were saying when we were discussing this, the whole the accents, the atmosphere, everything they were eating, even just going through the market and trying to barter,
Yes, we have to look up how much an egg costs. That's what you're there to do as a historian. You're there to do all that detail as well. So you've got the broad brushstroke history, but then you've got all the minute detail that goes into a scene like that, the dialogue and so on, all has to be dealt with by the historian that's working on the film. There is no script. You're working off improvisations. The script is sealed at the end of the scene, and it's shot. So everything's done through these improvisations. So you're making notes about what people are mentioning and what they're saying, and then you're assisting in the kind of the fine tuning of the dialogue while it's ongoing during the rehearsals. Yeah,
one character that stood out to me was Joseph, the Waterloo soldier.
Yes, Ogden, Joseph Ogden.
What was the symbolism, do you think, of that, like having the link between Waterloo and Peterloo?
Well, people made it at the time, and there were Waterloo veterans on both sides of the event, so both within the Hussars, let's say, but also on the field itself. And Joseph Ogden is loosely based on a character called John Lees, who was at Waterloo and died as a result of his wounds that he received on St Peter's Field. So he was there for both. He was at Waterloo and Peterloo, died at 22, so he was a young man. So, and one of the most famous quotes about Peterloo comes from him just before he died. Somebody quotes him as saying that, he was at Waterloo, but he had never felt so much danger at Waterloo than at Peterloo, because, there it was man to man, as in, on the field of battle. But here it was downright murder, is what he says. The reason we know about him, he's not just one of a number, is that there was this trial, a coroner's trial, in his death, because it was clear he died from violence. So there had to be a coroner's trial. And this trial became the kind of cause célèbre to finally get somebody responsible for these beatings, these maimings and beatings that occurred, the 15 or so people who died as a direct result, plus the 600 or 700 people who had been injured on the field, to finally get somebody brought to account for the deaths and the injuries. Unfortunately, the coroner's trial was actually closed down before any result could come from it.
Taking away from being historian for a second and kind of reflecting onto the modern day, Do you think there are parallels between Peterloo and the wider movement and things that are going on today politically?
As a historian, I prefer not to, actually, because it's one of the reasons I like dealing with history. Unlike you, I don't deal with contemporary or modern history. I very much roam around the long 18th century is my thing. I think that, you know, the thing that you can't sort of believe, and it was quite shocking the whole time, was the lack of care and thought and understanding and the sense of inequality, inbuilt, ingrained inequality, which, you know, in that sense it does resonate between now and then. Although I am still a firm believer that the past is a foreign country and they definitely do things differently there. Nonetheless, it's the inhumanity and the humanity that sort of wafts over the 2 centuries between us and Peterloo.
Great. Well, I think that's everything I have to ask. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
From meeting Jacqueline, it was really interesting finding out about the historical process behind the film and how integral this was to the making of it. And from Mike, it was really interesting finding out like the direction he wanted to go and obviously how important he finds Peterloo in an event in itself and to how it links to the modern day. I think when watching Peterloo, you really get some themes that are still present today. You know, there's issues of suffrage, democracy, people feeling powerless relative to the elites, and I think that hasn't necessarily gone away yet, and Peterloo is a really interesting way of kind of shedding light on that and how it's still happening.